Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name's Reverend David Keane. I'm Vicar of St James and St Peter's Church, Yeovil, and this is one of a number of webcasts that we're putting out during the time of the coronavirus shutdown. There's a series currently running on BBC4 with Dr. Mosley, who's going through some of the recent history of developments in medicine. And the history that he takes us into is quite remarkable, going back just 200 years to a time when there were no antibiotics, where there were no vaccines, where there was no anaesthetic, where there were a whole load of things that we take for granted in modern medicine, but which simply didn't exist at the time. And so in the course of the last 200 years, average life expectancy in the West has risen from 35 to about 80. So that's the equivalent of, for every year in that time, that life expectancy has gone up by about 10 weeks. So each additional day, several dozen minutes are added to human life expectancy. And things like the discovery of antibiotics, which meant that getting a simple wound, getting a simple scratch didn't mean that you could potentially lose your life, but it meant that they just became things that were treatable. Vaccines for things like smallpox and polio that have all but eradicated those things from the face of the planet. And so what the series does is it puts into perspective things that we now take for granted. The Book of Common Prayer, written way back 500 years ago, has a phrase, "In the midst of life we are in death," because for most people death was an everyday experience. Many children died during the very earliest years of life. Women died in childbirth. People didn't live to the age that I am now. Death was a common part of life. It was something, it certainly wasn't accepted, but it happened, and often it happened very, very quickly. People were used to it. And that phrase just doesn't quite ring right to us, because for most of us in the midst of life we are not in death. Death is pushed to the margins of our consciousness. It's something that we we'll think about when we get there, if we ever get there. And it's only ever reported on the news if it's something unusual, a terrorist attack or something terrible happening somewhere else in the world. What's happening now, of course, is that every night deaths from coronavirus are reported on the news. The tragic figures of deaths, both of people who've contracted the disease, of the people that are caring for them who've died from it as well. And increasingly we're going to see figures coming in from around the world of countries that are more and more vulnerable to this horrible virus, who are going to succumb to it. So now, very much so, in the midst of life we are in death. We're staying inside our houses, we're crossing the road to avoid people, we're queuing at a safe distance in supermarkets, because you don't know if the person in front of you in the queue or the person behind you in the queue is carrying something that might put you in hospital or might at the very worst kill you. And that's a pretty grim thought. It's a thought that most of us have not ever had to live with. And it's no wonder that people are feeling weighed down by it, that people are feeling exhausted by it, depressed by it, anxious about it. To be in the midst of death, in the midst of life, is a whole new world. It's a whole new way of living and being for all of us. What's the Christian approach to all of this? How do we understand it as Christians? We've just celebrated Easter, celebrating the dying and rising of Jesus Christ as an event in history that makes all the difference in the world. As St. Paul writes, if Christ has not been raised, if Jesus has not risen, then our faith is in vain. Christian faith without the actual death and resurrection of Jesus is just another way of being nice, but it doesn't really make any difference in the big things of life. Because of what Jesus claimed about himself, because Jesus claimed that he would rise from the dead, if he is still dead, then his claims really don't mean anything at all. He's just another interesting figure from history, but nobody particularly inspirational, and nobody that should change our view of the whole of the universe. But Christian faith rests on this one fact in history, that on that first Easter morning, that there was nobody in the tomb, not because it had been stolen, not because it had been taken away by the soldiers or the priests or the disciples, but because Jesus had walked out of it. The Jesus who had died 2 days before from crucifixion, from a horrible, torturous death, was now raised to life by God. No body could be discovered in the tomb, not because it had been thrown away, not because it had been stolen, but because the body had returned to life and walked out by the power of God. And Christian faith rests on this event in history, and a number of people have tried to disprove it over the years. There's a chap called Frank Morrison, who was fascinated by the person of Jesus, but felt there were all these strange myths around the last week of Jesus' life and the resurrection. And so he decided to investigate it, and as a result of this investigation was a book called Who Moved the Stone? And Frank Morrison writes that in that book, his whole thinking was changed because he realised that the only explanation for all the things around the death of Jesus, the fact of the empty tomb, the fact of the transformation of the disciples from a small defeated group of people living in lockdown for fear to a group of folk that just exploded into the ancient Near East and saw the church growing in thousands day by day by day, a group of people who all but one went to their deaths for proclaiming that Jesus was alive. This is not a group of people who had made it up. You don't go to your death for something that you know is a lie. A group of people who had met Jesus in various times and in various places. The idea that it was a mass hallucination doesn't fit. Jesus turns up on a road, he turns up by a lakeside, he turns up in a house, he turns up with individuals, he turns up with groups. That's not how hallucinations work. Everything about the events around the death and resurrection of Jesus, the only explanation that makes sense, however weird it seems, is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Once you exclude everything that doesn't make sense, the only explanation left is that Jesus really did rise, the disciples really did see him, and the proclamation that they went into the world with was the truth. When Jesus came to Mary and Martha, their brother Lazarus had died. He said to them, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die, and whoever dies and believes in me will live." Do you believe this? Do you believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? And he proceeded to demonstrate that by raising Lazarus from the dead. And so the Christian faith rests on this very weird and unusual thing, this unprecedented thing, that somebody who died returned to life. And it wasn't as though he kind of just fainted. There are explanations that say, well, maybe Jesus passed out on the cross, the Romans were stuck him for dead, he revived in the tomb, shoved the stone to one side and reappeared. If you've ever experienced crucifixion, and I hope you haven't, you'll realise that you don't just walk away from it. After several hours on the cross, you suffocate to death. Jesus had been flogged, he'd been beaten, he'd had to carry his own cross, he'd been nailed through hands and feet. He's not just going to revive and turn up and meet the disciples in a way that they think, oh wow, you've been raised from the dead. They would just go, mate, you're in a terrible state. We need to wash your wounds down and you need about a month's rest. The risen Jesus was a Jesus who had died and been raised from the dead. So do we believe it? What difference does it make? Well, there are two big things about the resurrection of Jesus that affect our attitude to death. The first is that the resurrected Jesus gives us a preview of what life after death will be. The New Testament talks about the resurrection body, to use its language, as a spiritual body, one animated by the Spirit of God, that our human life, our biological clock ticks down, the batteries run out. Eventually, our life is spent and our body is finished. But in biblical terms, the life of the body after death is not reliant on biological processes, but it's reliant on God. And God does not run down. God does not wear out. God's life is eternal. So if we are joined with that life, if we are plugged into an eternal recharger, to use a different metaphor, then our life does not end. And faith is about joining with God, plugging our life into God's life. And if our life is plugged into God's life, then our life goes on. And so Jesus' life is a preview, Jesus' resurrection body is a preview of what our resurrection will be like. It's physical, he can eat, he can drink, he can walk places, people can touch him, but it also seems to have capabilities that the normal human body hasn't got. People have difficulty recognizing Jesus at first. There's something different about him, but also something the same. So there's a continuity, but a discontinuity with this, that the resurrection is not just a spiritual floating on a cloud thing. It's a physical thing. It involves a continuity with who we are, but also a radical change in who we are. And the second thing about resurrection is that how the New Testament talks about those who've died, that it uses the language of falling asleep. Now, hopefully you get a good night's sleep, you fall asleep, and the next thing you know is that you've woken up and it's a new day. And that's the image the Bible uses. That death is falling asleep, after which we wake up. We wake up in a new place, we wake up with Jesus, we wake up to eternal life with him. In C.S. Lewis's image, it's the end of term and the holidays have begun and the holidays go on forever. So Christian faith in the light of death is based in this historical fact of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and it changes how we view death. It's not a brick wall, it's a doorway. It's an entrance point into life with God forever. And it's something that for some of us, if our lives are terrible, we look forward to. We just long for it to be over so that we can be at peace and be with God. For others, yes, that sounds like a great idea, but there's plenty to do here and now to make this world more the way that God wants it. And that's certainly the attitude of the Bible, that Jesus has given us a job to do, which is not just to wait for death to take us out of here, but to bring life here and now. Jesus wants people to have life in all its fullness, and that's not a promise for then, but that's supposed to be a reality now, and that's something that we're supposed to share. But whilst in the midst of life we are in death, the death and resurrection of Jesus change death itself, so that though we mourn those that we've lost, and though every single death is a tragedy, we don't mourn without hope. That those who are plugged into the Lord, those who by faith have joined their lives with Jesus, those lives are not over. The epitaph for Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the USA, reads like this: "Here lies the body of Benjamin Franklin, a printer. Like an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding. But the work shall not be lost, because it will, as he believed, appear once again in a new and more excellent edition, fully updated and corrected by the author." This is the Christian faith, that the work shall not be lost, because it will appear once again in a new and more perfect edition, fully updated and corrected by the author. If you want a digital version, given that we're now in digital times, Tom Wright, the theologian, talks of God holding all of our life in his long-term memory, so that when our hardware breaks down, God can recreate it and upload everything back again. God is the ultimate cloud storage, that God holds all of us in his love, and God is able to restore all of us to be the fullest version of ourselves. So whilst we dwell with the terrible statistics, and every statistic is a person, whilst we live with the fear and the concern and the restrictions that all this puts upon us, we can also live with hope because of what happened to Jesus on that first Good Friday and that first Easter Sunday. Christians are people of hope. We are Easter Sunday people in a Good Friday world. And so whatever you believe, if you're not sure you're a Christian, if you're not sure about the events of Jesus, look into what happened on that first Easter Sunday. Because if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it changes absolutely everything. And if you do already believe it, then may God impress that more deeply on your heart, so that we can live as people of hope, as people whose eyes are on the risen Jesus, and who are able to share that life with the world. Thanks very much for listening. May God bless you, whatever else you're doing today.